Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the podcast series from CSC. My name is Sarah Summers and I'm the Primary STEM Development Officer at CSC. In this podcast, I am joining Joanne Nichols, our lead practitioner for secondary science from Aberdare Community School, and her secondary colleagues from across our region to discuss science literacy for pupils during the transition phase from primary to secondary school. So what I find really interesting is that the research evidence demonstrates that disciplinary literature is far more challenging for pupils to infer and understand because of the abstract nature of it and how it's so far away from the natural language that our pupils use on a daily basis. I know that many of our primary schools in our region have taken on the STEM storytime approach, where they're using storybooks to enhance the teaching and learning of science. By doing this, it provides the language for the pupils to explore through their practical situations in which the teacher can talk explicitly and explain in the science words in context, like how we read the science words and how we say them to be able to write them correctly. I've also seen some really good examples of teachers in Key Stage 2 across the region using morphology of science vocabulary to break down the science words into the prefix, the root, the suffix, and translate each part of the word to explain the scientific meaning, very much like your word of the week approach that you do in Aberdare, Joe. So what I'm interested to hear in this episode is what are your approaches to incorporate scientific literacy into your transition work to prepare those pupils for the language of science that they will become more familiar with as they move and progress with their learning with you in secondary schools. So, Joe, shall we start with you?
We have a huge number of feeder primary schools, which for us was a massive issue. And previous to the pandemic, we would have lots of open evenings. We would have, pupils come up for transition days in year 5 and year 6. The building that I work in, I'm very lucky, is fantastic new building, good facilities. So there's that wonder, isn't there, when, they first come up when they're in a lab, that's got sinks and taps and it's all about that wonder. Obviously there's, the current condition that we find ourselves in, thanks to the pandemic, has stopped that. And so, we had to, come up with another thing that we did there. We'd previously worked with primary colleagues in year 6 when we were looking at assessment. But in terms of teaching, I always used to feel quite uncomfortable that primary colleagues would look to us as the experts. I don't know if anybody else has found that here and would be saying to us, is this right? Is this right? And actually some of what they were doing was really high order science work. For us, the biggest issue is, I would say, having 16, 17 feeder primary schools is the different array of science teaching and experience that they have in those schools. But it's familiarity with apparatus and the naming of that apparatus for us, which was something that we worked on. So we have produced a transition booklet since we've had the issue with COVID. Which we sent out to primary schools, which is an additional resource that they can use. But what we find is that we spend a lot of our first term doing science skills, where we introduce those terminology of apparatus, variables, where we, safety in the lab. It's a completely different room, isn't it? That they would used to be in, and focus very much on some previous podcast discussions that we've mentioned, like the language of graph drawing and that kind of thing. So that's been our thing. I mean, it is a shame that we haven't got to see them so much. Like I said, we used to make those links, foster those links with the feeder primaries from year 5, and it was well established where they would come up several times. We would do a project. I think we did about the science of chocolate. Slime also was in there somewhere, as slime often was. So a substitute for now has been the transition booklet, but it will be whether or not we keep that in addition to the in-person experiences as well. Beth?
We also made a transition booklet. So, like I said previously, we've started doing Planet Last in year 7. So we made a transition booklet to send out to our Catholic feeder primaries for them to do over the summer, which sort of fed into that. And we built in lots of the literature whole school policies that we were talking about in the previous one. So there are Freya model things. There's one about weather in there. Trying to find non-examples of weather was very interesting. But just to get them sort of familiar with the strategies that we're using in secondary. And yeah, we focused on variables, we focused on drawing graphs and little things like that, just to get them ready for when they come up. It's not so much of a culture shock of going from their sort of safe, everything all in one room, to being in a lab and it all being completely new. And linking back to what you said about sort of meeting primaries for levelling purposes before, I'd sat down and I've had teachers pull out, year 6 teachers pull out work that they'd done on hearts, where they dissected hearts and like these beautiful anatomically accurate drawings that these year 6 children had created. And I'm like, I couldn't get that out of a GCSE child. And they're asking me, is this level 5? As if I'm the font of knowledge, and I'm a physicist. So I'm like, you know as much as I do. But yeah, so to ease our transition, we found that this little booklet has sort of helped a little bit, and it's built their confidence. So our current 7s have come up feeling happy and comfortable, and we've still done sort of lab safety and our traditional things as well alongside our Planet Last, but it's sort of helped to just foster those good relationships, really.
Yeah, and I know that we'd said that, nobody is here today who is from a 3 to 16 school. But that must be great, mustn't it? I think having spoken to some colleagues, that ability, timetabling allowed to go down and begin this, like we've said, this discussion of science capital, this science literacy from a very young age. As a parent of a year 4 pupil, when we were doing the very stressful home learning, and when the science work was sent home, it was of a really high standard. And I think it's just, you're just not aware of that as a secondary science teacher, that there is so much good practice going on out there. And I noticed, Beth, you said, you sent stuff out, but when I would imagine if you've got a smaller, set of feeder schools, that those links are able to be made much more easily. I know in the past, when I used to work in Aberdare Girls' School before the amalgamation, we did go down to the primary schools, with our boxes of Bunsen burners and our heat-proof mats, and we would do the odd lesson to year 6. But I do think we are, I think our colleagues in 3 to 16 schools have got a real opportunity here, haven't they, to really promote science and science capital, which I think, Sarah, primary colleagues would welcome that, I think.
Oh, most definitely. And I think what's been really lovely to hear, is how much you value the knowledge and what's going on in the primary schools before the children come up to you. the 3 to 16 schools, they are in a very fortunate place where they can really develop that sequential learning, particularly with disciplinary literacy, not just for science, but, for all the other disciplines as well. I think the challenge comes in when there are other primary feeder schools then feeding into that secondary school with the pupils that are flowing through it. So it's about developing consistency as well, isn't it? And I think what's been really nice to listen to, not just in this episode, but in your previous episodes that you've done, all the different approaches that you've used to develop oracy, to develop reading, to develop the writing for science, is things that, we are doing really good things in primary school, but there might be a new strategy now that the primary teachers, particularly in year 5 and year 6, can take on board and think, well, I might have a go at this and implement this into my science lessons, because it just gives that greater abundance of scientific knowledge, doesn't it? And the pupils being able to access the science, and that when you talked, Bethan, about, getting them ready, and then that feeling of I am ready and I feel comfortable and I'm happy to come into this new environment, because the lab is so much different to a classroom, and in itself that can just put the fear factor into children. When we're talking about scientists being that stereotypical in a white coat, and you see a lab is very, very different for some children. So I think the health and well-being and just that whole feeling of I am able to access the science, I'm ready for it, is something that we can share all of these good strategies, and that, we talk about Curriculum for Wales and that progression step 3. If we can really incorporate all the great things that you're doing in your year 7 and your year 8 classrooms, in as well as in our year 5 and year 6, and just, enhance the range of strategies that we're doing by sharing this good practice, I think is something so valuable. Thank you. I was just wondering, Dale, have you got anything that you'd like to share?
Yes, like we said, the last few years, the transition has been a little bit higgledy-piggledy with everything going on. And we actually did a transition week, 2 weeks at the start of the year for year 7. So they were in form groups based on sort of friendship groups and things like that coming up from primary schools. We also did a lot of baseline testing then. They did some sort of CAT tests and that sort of stuff, which isn't the most interesting way perhaps to start your secondary school experience, but to trade off that, like in science lessons, we did those kind of typical transition experiences for them, just to get them getting used to the lab and building that confidence and knowing their way around the school. And then from that point on, and then in science and maths they were set into sets, but we've got mixed ability whole school with all the other subjects. So sort of that's kind of a work in progress a little bit. And like Joe mentioned, we do a lot of the skills kind of things at the start of year 7. So the first topic is just called skills, very unimaginative. And we talk about the variables, and we talk about, risk assessments and that. And starting to reach the conclusion now that I think we need to maybe jazz it up a little bit more. And it goes back to the science capital approach of getting in those relevant investigations, those relevant practicals, and teaching those skills more within that context. I know last year it was changed because we couldn't do practicals properly with everything. So now it's moving forward. I think the next step for that is to embed those skills more within investigations, so that they're actually getting their hands on a bit more and developing those skills like live, if you like, and getting a slightly better experience there. But that can link back into our sort of transition program as well.
You could call it science skills to jazz it up a bit, Dale, perhaps.
I'll post it now.
Paul, you've done some work on this, haven't you?
Well, I was thinking about, as people were speaking, the curriculum for Wales, because we, at the start of, I can't remember when it was now, after half term, we had an inset day where, now I wasn't able to attend because I had COVID, but the science department went to Trelai Primary at one of our feeders, and all the other primaries, our feeder primaries, sent their science, I don't know what they call them at primary, not specialist, the person who leads on science. So there was a lot of discussion then about, collaborative projects that we can look at going forward. We're having another inset day in January where we can start planning that. So I think the curriculum for Wales is really going to open this up once the pandemic allows it, where we can do a lot. We can much more build on what they are doing in primary, because there's a lot of, I think Bethan said earlier about the level of work that when we did meet to moderate, the level of work that is done at primary is amazing. The primary colleagues were asking at the inset that I wasn't at, what do you want from the pupils when they come up? Well, we want the sort of exactly what they're doing. We want them to be skilled when they're looking at investigations, and the investigation work that is done at primary school, it is, as Bethan said, is stupendous. It surpasses a lot of the stuff that some of my year 11 pupils can do. So what we want from primary colleagues is exactly what they're doing. We recognise, they are not, they are masters of all subjects, whereas we are just, supposed experts in one or three subjects. So I'm really looking forward to developing new projects, and then so the transition becomes even more seamless. This year we weren't able to have any pupils visit. Esther Lewis, one of my colleagues, did online lessons where pupils in the different primaries I think they were making slime, not surprisingly, but she delivered that. So that was all we could manage this year. But going forward, with the new curriculum for Wales, the possibilities really are endless, I think.
I totally agree with you there, Paul. I think, the collaborative work that we can do across the schools within our clusters just opens up so many doors, doesn't it? We've all got skills and knowledge that we can share, and you just think of all the different strategies that we can pull together to really enhance the learning for the children. But going back to that science capital approach, it's doing what's right for your pupils as well, isn't it? And I think working together really, really will sort of enhance that. So yeah, I totally agree with you there. Jo, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I wanted to come in on one of the things that Paul was saying. I think because one of the things that you want to maintain is this enthusiasm that the primary pupils have for learning, isn't it? Which they come to you and they're so enthusiastic about everything, and I've got an 8-year-old who just loves everything and loves school. And one of the things that, when we were talking about curriculum for Wales, about this very, bespoke approach to things, Sarah, where we were saying, you can do what your pupils want and what your pupils need. It's interesting being a parent of a junior now. I keep forgetting that it's year 4, not year 3, because we've lost a year because of COVID. But we, very much when we went to our first curriculum for Wales meetings, it was, you can teach them what you want. You can teach them what you want. And of course, that's not true, is it? Because it's very much, this is just my experience, and I would imagine that it's similar elsewhere, is that as a class, my little one, they were asked at the start of the term what their favourite things were, what they'd like to learn about. And of course, often dinosaurs is a top theme that's up there. But then actually dinosaurs are used to teach the science of things like, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, nocturnal, the covering of a skin, and they can't have been mammals because they weren't covered in this. And it was absolutely high ordered stuff. But of course, again, in terms of science capital, it was driven through something that they were already enthusiastic about. And we've mentioned slime, which may have passed its peak time now, but there was a time, certainly for our transition project, and Paul, you'd mentioned, and I know we did, we made that much slime, it was, literally coming out of our ears. But it is about, isn't it, that hook, that science capital. What do they like? How can we use it as a vehicle to drive the knowledge aspects of things, which for me was really interesting as both a parent now, but as a practitioner as well. Because certainly when I was going to Curriculum for Wales insets, that was something that I thought, well, actually, yeah, what they do is they say, what do you like? Again, pupil voice. Okay, how can we drive that? Yeah, Dale. Sorry.
Go on, Dale.
Going to pick up on what you're saying about this, the learner-led kind of curriculum. Obviously, that could throw up a challenge in the future or make transition even more crucial in the fact that primary schools' approaches in terms of the way that they teach and their learning may be very, very different from what we're doing in a secondary context, which is where there might be an advantage for those sort of through schools and that sort of thing. Our sort of strategy in Whitmore is a very direct method with the modelling and then the independent work at the end, which might be very different from certain ways that primaries are doing it. So that was just something that sort of jumped into my head then, that there might be a body of work to do with transition. It might be important then for us to be getting in and just easing that. Otherwise, it will be an extra bit of a shock for them to adapt to when they come up.
Yeah, Sarah, what's your thoughts on that? I interrupted you. Sorry, bad podcast etiquette.
No. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the new curriculum is very much tailored to develop the 4 purposes. That's our main aim of this new curriculum. And by the science that we teach, it is very much centred around, how will we develop pupils to become purposeful, people that they can lead fulfilling lives in society. But even though that the curriculum is purpose-led, it is very much that the science hasn't changed, hasn't it? Science knowledge and science skills are science knowledge and science skills, and that will always be. I think the important thing from this new curriculum is the experiences that we provide to the children. Very much the experiences are on equal par with the knowledge and the skills that we provide for the children to learn. And it's through those experiences that we can develop our pupils in line with the 4 purposes, but also to ensure that they are knowledge rich and that they have the skills that they need to apply and to develop as scientists. And that transition work, I think, can be key for that, can't it? Because there are many schools that are taking, as you said, a context approach where they might use the theme of a dinosaur. Some other schools are using what they're calling lenses. So they're looking at science through a lens, maybe more of an abstract lens like climate change. And they're asking the children and using the children's opinions to manipulate and teach the science that the children need to know. And that's very interesting in itself. And what I was very interested, I sat in on a webinar from the University College of London where they delivered the primary science capital teaching approach. And it's very much what you've talked about here in your transition projects. It's not changing what you do, it's tweaking what you do to hook the children in. And to provide them with some exciting opportunities where they're interested and they feel comfortable to be able to access the science. They're interested, they want to know more, they're eager. And by doing that, I think the disciplinary language naturally comes into that, doesn't it? And making it a safe space. So if there is any language in the transition work or any work that you do within Year 7 and Year 8, if the children don't understand what the language means, feeling comfortable to say, well, what does that mean? I don't understand that word. I know that word, but it doesn't sit right with what I'm doing in my lesson today. And that very much comes down to the health and wellbeing, doesn't it? Which is what Curriculum for Wales is the ethos of it, I suppose, is that the health and wellbeing for our learners within our science lessons and that safe space, and saying it's okay to take risks, it's okay to make mistakes. And again, that comes down to experiences. So I think from a transition point of view, Curriculum for Wales, I think, has done us a favour where we can work more collaboratively. It's given us the means and hopefully the time built in for it to work with colleagues across our cluster to think about, well, what experiences can we give to our children before they come up to year 7, and then how can we build on those experiences to develop the scientific knowledge and skills when the children are in year 7 and year 8, so that they are ready then as they go on to sit their exams later on in the secondary school. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you. I've really enjoyed listening in to your shared experiences. I think they've been very valuable, and I know our primary colleagues across the region as well as our secondary colleagues will take away a lot from this episode. But a huge thank you to all of you and to Joe for leading on this podcast series. Each episode has been fantastic, great series to listen to, and I'm sure they will, provide much thought-provoking discussions in departmental meetings and inset sessions within our schools. So diolch yn fawr pawb.
Diolch am wrando ar y benod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.